let you know that as a native Southerner and a white Southerner, I've always been fascinated with my home region. And I've always been fascinated with the way it functions and some of the great things that it does and some of the not so great things that come out of the region. And I don't necessarily want to turn this into a heavy critique of the South, but I do want you to think about how in the wake of the post-civil rights movement, in this post-civil rights movement era, there's some amazing challenges still left to be fought, and some struggles that still go on. And so I'm a cultural historical geographer, but my interests are very much in the politics of culture and the politics of space and location and geography. My interest in terms of street naming really focused along three major avenues, no pun intended. All right, you're getting better. I'm very much interested in documenting as a new landscape feature, because it is relatively new compared to the rest of the landscape, a relatively new landscape feature. I'm interested in understanding the frequency, the location, the characteristics of streets named for Dr. King. I'm really very much interested in the politics. Why is it controversial? Because it is controversial, as I'll talk about, to so many people, or at least the communities that deal with it. And I'm also interested in some ways to have my work help. And I'm interested in trying to build community strategies that can perhaps help negotiate some of that public debate. I'm a firm believer that we do the world no good by sitting in our offices doing research if we in fact have ways in which we can help the public. So in addition to being an egomaniac and liking to talk to the media, I really do think it's in some ways a responsibility for academics to engage the community. In case you don't know, because it's easy to miss this, some people when they hear about what I do, they think, well, that seems very insignificant. In fact, I've had people say that to my face. Why don't you do something for real? And most people don't think the street naming really is that significant or it can even be that controversial. But in fact, I can take you to Melbourne, Florida, and I can tell you about the over 2-decade-old struggle to name a street for King there, and they're still unsuccessful in naming that street. They've had public meetings, angry outbursts, hurt feelings. In other places, we've seen boycotts and marches because of the issue. We've seen petition drives. We've even seen people get arrested for being very emotional about it, for threatening people. We've seen people vandalize streets that are recently renamed. There's a place in Florida that street signs have been ripped down. Street signs that reflect Dr. King's name have been ripped down a grand total of 110 times. I can tell you about activists that chain themselves to signs in an attempt to keep them from being renamed or changed. So as much as it may not seem to be a critical social issue, I would suggest to you that this is something that is perhaps not the most important issue in the world. There are many of those. But I would suggest to you that this really has much more symbolic gravity and much more political importance than most people would give it credit. Okay. Some of the bigger questions that I've tried to answer in some of my work dealing with these streets is really using them as indicators, using them as barometers of different things, and looking exactly at what did they tell us about the legacy of King and the movement. What is it that we want to remember about the movement? What is it that we don't want to remember? I also have used these streets to try to get a gauge on what's the present day state of race relations in America, and in the South in particular. Because one of the things I'm going to suggest to you tonight, and I have a little fancy mantra, it's one of the few things I've developed on my own, that street naming is really about where ideology hits asphalt. In other words, we often get a true gauge of people's feelings and ideologies and sentiments when we look at the street naming issue, when you bring those to the ground. As geographers, we're very sensitive to how things get grounded, how they get expressed materially on the landscape. And so keep that in mind. And that leads me to the final big question is I hope to show you tonight that geography plays a major role in this debate over remembering King. And that in fact, geography is perhaps one of the core issues. And it's not geography in just terms of places on a map. It's the geography of our racial boundaries. It's the geography of how we see the world and who belongs where and who doesn't belong where. Okay. Everyone understands so far? Okay, very good. So the purpose of the talk tonight, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the prevalence and pattern of street naming. I'm going to talk a little bit about the symbolic and political importance of street naming, and then get a little bit into the politics. The whole talk could really be about politics. It's really intriguing. One of the things I've learned a lot is I visit communities that are in the middle of the street naming debate, and I'm the one who's the student. I'm the one basically learning as I watch the process. And there's a lot you can learn about how people see race and power in America by actually sitting in on a city council meeting or sitting in on a county commission meeting. As boring as they may be. Do you guys have yours on like a local TV? Yeah. Again, if you have sleep problems, read my book, watch city council meetings. Okay, so let's talk about some of the patterns and the prevalence. This is a map. It's now a few years old. There are at least 730 streets named for King in the United States. I will tell you that this does not reflect the entire set of streets. It's extremely hard to collect this data, mainly because there are some streets that don't have mail delivered to them as an address, or they may exist in certain ways like a bypass or a perimeter highway, or it's just sometimes very tough to find that street. So this is basically a product of several years of searching multiple databases. For example, one of the things that doesn't pop up on this map, and I learned this as I was preparing for this talk. That's right, I prepared for the talk. Is that you guys have a Martin Luther King Memorial Bridge in town. Now that does not show up on the map, mainly because it's very tough unless you're accessing some online spatial databases or maps. It often doesn't pop up on traditional address databases. If you look at the actual pattern in terms of the frequency, 70% of those Martin Luther King streets, if you remember, if you saw the map, you see it's very focused and concentrated in the South, even though it's a national movement. It's also a very Southern movement. You see that 70% of them are in 7 Southern states, and I've got those listed there. I'm a Georgia boy, UGA, Bulldogs. My state's number 1, as it should be. But you notice that Mississippi, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, even North Carolina to a lesser extent, these seem to be the real core, numerically, of the street naming movement. South Carolina, Virginia, don't feel bad, a little bit further down the list, not nearly as frequent as some of these other southern, deep South states. Some of this should make a lot of sense, because even though the civil rights movement was fought all across the United States, this is sort of the traditional core of the early struggles of the civil rights movement. King was from Georgia. That's his native state. So some of this makes a little bit of sense. But here's what's also interesting. Even though the South plays such a major role in the street naming campaign, the very first street name for King was in Chicago. It was 4 months after King's assassination. And they essentially decided to put King's name on a major street that runs through the Black South Side. There was actually a counter-proposal to put King's name on a crosstown expressway, but Mayor Daley put a nail in that. He was very much, if you know anything about Chicago politics, about pleasing certain wards, not disrupting other constituents. And so, for the most part, this was a way of appeasing African Americans, but not getting in the face of white Chicagoans. So, what's interesting about the Chicago case, in addition to being the first, is if you notice, there seems to be a pattern. This sort of tendency to put these streets in largely African American neighborhoods. And that is a pattern that dates right back to the very first street. I would suggest to you that it's a pattern that continues today. And I'll show you some examples. All right? Even in Atlanta, King's hometown, home city, they eventually named a street in 1976, but after much debate. They went back and forth about the most appropriate street. They went back and forth about whether they should even name a street. Here's what's also surprising. Some of the most vocal opponents in Atlanta to naming the street are African Americans. Remember that King is a national icon, but particularly right after his death, and even during the movement, he was not necessarily a universally embraced figure. He was controversial within his own community. There's a really interesting story in Chicago where one of King's rivals within the religious community had a church that was located on this street in Chicago named for King. And he had a bitter rivalry with King. And when that street was renamed, his church, the Olivia Church there in Chicago, he built a new entrance to the church so that his church would not have to have King's address. So this was a prominent African-American figure, also leader of the civil rights movement, but a very different take on King's popularity. So King is a controversial figure, not just between blacks and whites, but in some cases within his own community. In terms of putting this in historical context, on average, everybody loves an average. There's been about 19 streets named per year since the assassination. That's really a bit misleading and probably not very useful. I don't know why I showed it to you. But in reality, the vast majority of streets have appeared after the King National Holiday. You don't know this, the King National Holiday was passed in the early 1980s, first observed 1986, signed into law by Ronald Reagan. That's another story. But basically, I suggest to you that it's the holiday that really was a kickstart for naming streets for King in a couple of ways. Number one, by making a national holiday for King, it granted King tremendous legitimacy. So now communities and activists and local communities could go to their city council and say, we've got a national hero here, so we need to rename the street. I would suggest, however, that probably the holiday was helpful in another way. That in fact, holidays are important, but they come and go. You observe it for one day, you go back to your normal pattern. Some people, not everybody observes these holidays. When you name a street or build a monument, you're creating a physically permanent reminder of King's legacy that's there all the time. It's not hooked to one day at a time. And so it's that yearning for that physical monument, that piece of geography to reflect memory that is probably behind the street naming. And to be honest, some of the activists I've spoken with, they tell me that they thought that street naming would be easy. Hence my title, No Easy Road. Because in fact, it was not nearly as easy as they had hoped. All right, everybody catching on to my sophisticated thinking? All right, you guys are a tough crowd. They should have warned me. I'm going to speak to you later about it. All right. One of the things I want to get across to you is that the street name for King doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, it often gets connected with holiday celebrations, holiday marches, holiday protests. It often serves as a symbolic platform, a physical platform for carrying out these other campaigns. In this case, this is actually a march down Martin Luther King in my hometown, Greenville, North Carolina, during a King holiday event. And yeah, they're honoring King, but they're also protesting unfair employment practices. So King's memory isn't static. It gets to be used as a platform for other causes. Sometimes I get asked the question, well, are King streets only found in big cities? Because we often associate those streets, like Chicago, with big cities. But in fact, what we do, if you look statistically, as I mentioned to my colleague, I'm not a statistician, so let's not have any tough questions. But if you look statistically, you find street naming happening across the urban hierarchy. It's certainly taking place in larger places, but it's also taking place in smaller places. Now, keep in mind that one of the reasons this graph looks the way it does is that we have a lot more smaller places in the world than we do larger places. That's the inherent part of an urban hierarchy. But I think what this shows is that there are actually a movement to remember King in a variety of different places, small and large, rural and urban. In fact, I find some of the more fascinating stories about remembering King in smaller places. That's actually one of the areas I've specialized in. Let's turn this a little bit to a different direction. This is actually a map showing public schools named for King. You notice it's a little bit different pattern, isn't it? It's not nearly as concentrated in the South, although this map has changed. I can tell you that some of that has filled in the South. But at this point in 2003, it was much more in the Northeast, the Midwest, and certainly the West Coast. I don't know if that has something to do with the special history of school desegregation in the South. I think there's a lot of viable theories, but I don't have a complete answer. Here's where you guys fit in again, because I completely screwed up. You guys actually have a Martin Luther King Middle School. Didn't show up on the radar. See that? And in fact, if you don't know where that is, I don't have my You see the bridge there? That's the memorial bridge I spoke about. And you see the little red circle? That's the school. So that's actually, so there for techniques.
Yeah.
But the point is, you guys have a very interesting, strong legacy of King here on your own landscape, whether you knew it or not. And actually, to tell you the truth, I'm learning as a result of preparing for this talk. Let me tell you a little story about Riverside, California. Riverside, California in the late 1990s decided it was going to build a new high school. And the high school would be a largely white suburban high school. And they basically went through the process of determining what they would name that high school. And there was a big movement to name the high school after King. Well, as soon as that happened, there was a huge uproar of controversy from parents, some parents, not all parents. And in fact, it reached CNN, even the Jerry Springer Show. Now, all important things eventually make it to the Jerry Springer Show. This is where the bald-headed guy comes out and tackles me. All right? You guys are tough. All right, so the point is, parents were protesting naming this school for King because they said the school's going to be largely white. How does this really matter? And even some parents went on the record, believe it or not, to suggest that if their students had a Martin Luther King High School in their transcript, they claimed that it would hurt their chances of getting in college. This is 1998, 1999. This is the kind of sort of discourse that we were hearing. And in fact, I can tell you, because I just checked in with this school, I call people up, checked in with this school not too long ago, and this school's doing great. They're off the charts with test scores, and students are doing quite well. So you see what I'm getting at? There's a lot of perceptions and misperceptions about what King's name means, and that gets often folded into the politics of naming streets and schools. There's even an international component. This is a photograph from Italy from one of my colleagues, and I'm sure he was doing serious research in between drinking bottles of wine. But the point is, he sent me this photograph, and there are numerous examples internationally of schools and plazas and streets being named for King internationally. Remember, King is probably, I would say, just as famous, certainly comparable in terms of his fame internationally. By the way, a great research project would be to actually compare internationally the street naming process in one of these places versus what we see in America. That would be a great geographic research project. I actually had this fantasy, I'm going to keep it clean. I had this fantasy about actually going to South Africa and looking at street naming patterns, because I don't know if you know this, but with the transition to a post-apartheid, there's been a wholesale stripping of old names and a renaming of streets. And looking at, and in fact, there's been riots about it in some of those places, where people are very emotionally attached to some of these old names that are vestiges of apartheid. So there's a lot of, not just social, not just national, regional implications. There's a lot of international implications to looking at the politics of naming. One of the other things that's interesting is that if you actually visit these streets, you often find that they're connected with other memorials and monuments. For example, you go to Portland, Oregon, you can actually see this very nice monument statue of King with some kids. A lot of King statues, if you look across America, have him sort of looking forward into the future with children to his back, sort of leading the generation forward, very educational type themes. These are two very interesting monuments that you find in places named for King. Jackson, Mississippi. Freedom Corner marks the intersection of Medgar Evers Boulevard and Martin Luther King Boulevard. If you know anything about the history of the movement, those two guys played pivotal roles in the movement. They both were also martyrs, although they worked at different scales and different agendas. Interesting enough, this site, in addition to the fact that it remembers Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King, is still a very symbolically loaded site, because when Mississippi City Council people in this Jackson were protesting the Confederate battle flag, they burned the Confederate battle flag right in front of this Freedom Corner monument. So this is a site that has not just historical meaning, but it's very intense contemporary political meaning too. Rocky Mount, North Carolina, they have a statue to King and a park named for King. And this statue, believe it or not, generated quite a bit of debate. Some opponents, including many African Americans, said that the statue did not look like King. They also took issue with the fact that the statue has a bit of an arrogant pose. I don't see it that way, but that's their read. And as a result, they had the city hacksaw it down and store it in a big garage, city garage, for several years. When they finally couldn't come to terms with how to erect a new statue, and they ran out of money, they decided to put up the old statue, and you can't see it, but it was re-welded back to the platform. And I put this forward to you not to make fun of Rocky Mountain, although they're very near where I live, and maybe they deserve to be made fun of. But no, seriously, I bring up Rocky Mountain because I think it's important to realize that there's a bit of a reputational politics that surrounds Martin Luther King. That in fact, he's not remembered in just one way. Different people have different visions of what King should look like, physically, literally, as well as what he represents or symbolizes figuratively. Okay. You go to Savannah, Georgia, you actually see Martin Luther King Boulevard, and along Martin Luther King Boulevard is it's a pretty nice civil rights museum. What's interesting or ironic is if you go inside the civil rights museum, it says nothing about King. It simply talks about the local civil rights movement that took place in Savannah. And in fact, there's an interesting story about Savannah and King. This has been well documented by some historians that I read. Basically, the local civil rights leaders in Savannah didn't want King to visit the city back in the 60s. They were already having a pretty good amount of success with their movement. And they felt like bringing King in might distract them or actually bring some media attention that they didn't want. So they were not anti-King, but it's amazing how King's reputation really was quite complicated. And his position in the movement was quite complicated, and that doesn't always get translated onto the landscape. Because this image almost implies a harmony between the movement and King and the Savannah movement itself. By the way, I'm feeling pretty good. All right. People often ask me, what's your favorite Martin Luther King street? And actually, I have a lot of favorites. But Pawleys Island, South Carolina is one of my favorites. Anybody been to Pawleys Island? Okay. If you go down that street, and you don't have to, it's just a suggestion. You go down that street, you'll actually see that marker, which you see down at the lower part of the slide. And that marker actually reads, honoring a world citizen who never walked this road, but whose life's work helped all those who do. And what's interesting about that inscription, and I guess why it really gets to me, is that in working with so many communities about the street naming issue, the one argument that we consistently hear is that why are we remembering this sort of national figure and not remembering local people? And I think there's a dangerous assumption. This isn't to say that local folks shouldn't be remembered, but there's a dangerous assumption here that somehow King isn't of local relevance. And in fact, we do know that while there are many people who work across the movement locally, nationally, internationally, that in fact King did have a local impact. And so I think this monument and this street actually speaks to that pretty well. This is my other favorite. This is Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King Highway in Jacksonville, North Carolina. I like it because it's probably one of the few instances, it may be the only one, where Coretta Scott and Martin Luther King are honored together. Here's also an interesting other tidbit, and I can't show you the full picture, but a little bit further down the road is the Ronald Reagan Expressway. And the juxtaposition of Ron Reagan with the Kings is quite ironic, quite telling. Because even though Ron Reagan signed and approved the holiday in the 80s, he really, in many ways, said some very pointed, derogatory things about King. And in fact, he's known within political circles for dismantling much of affirmative action. And he actually used much of King's rhetoric and words to actually legitimize that. So on the landscape, there can be some really interesting ironies, ways that prompt you to think about the past. So it's not just a simple, transparent reflection of the past. It's where geography really can make you think. All right, so let's talk about some of the symbolic political importance of street naming. And I'm going to sort of focus a little bit more on the South and other regions because this is where I do my thing. Keep in mind that in addition to the fact that these streets named for King are honoring a person who obviously worked on behalf of racial equality, it's important to realize that in the case of the South, they are taking place, they are a watershed event in a South that has traditionally said something very different about the past. and said something very different about the role of African Americans in that past. Whether it's Confederate monuments in front of courthouses, or the very romantic notions of the plantation and Gone with the Wind. Remember, an African American perspective of the plantation would be vastly different versus the Confederate battle flag that we talked about. So a lot of this street naming is taking place in a region that's already has a great deal of anxiety about the past, a great deal of anxiety about memory and race. And that makes the politics and the political importance even more. And in fact, there's an ongoing movement, not just with street naming, but across America, to recover the African American experience. Whether it's trying to come to terms with how best to remember slavery, or if it's Juneteenth, Emancipation Day, or if it's like in Jackson, Mississippi, trying to encourage people to drive along and look at sites related to the Civil Rights Movement. Or how do we best remember Jim Crow? How do we come to terms with our era of segregation? I will say one thing that I think is particularly important. There's been an active disenfranchisement of women on street naming. You very rarely, Coretta Scott was an exception, Rosa Parks in a few places, but for the most part, when you look at the landscape and geography of street naming, you do not see the role that women obviously played in the movement. You take, for example, King's first and most noted, or first and probably most important early campaign with Montgomery bus boycott, where much of the Montgomery bus boycott was carried out by rank-and-file women workers who worked all through the night, putting out information, organizing people. That kind of history, that gender component, not just race, but that gender component, often is invisible on these street names. I think this picture probably captures better than anybody where we are in terms of the South. We're at a crossroads in terms of memory, where Martin Luther King and Jeff Davis crossed over each other in Selma, Alabama. Selma already a very symbolically looking city, both from a Civil War and a Civil Rights Movement history perspective. By the way, just to let you know, and I just found this out, the Jeff Davis part of that sign, that road, has now been removed. It's now been replaced by the name of a local civil rights activist who worked on behalf of folks in Selma. So there is this naming of streets for King and how it fits into and perhaps challenges traditional conceptions of the past is actually it's changing, and it's changing in very pronounced ways on the landscape. I will tell you this: no matter how you feel about the issue, for or against, indifferent, we are in an exciting time in the South right now. We are in a very exciting time in terms of looking at cultural change, symbolic landscape. I don't know what you'll tell your grandkids. I'll probably tell them they're rotten. But you may end up telling your grandkids about living through some of these changes. I really think it's that important. Keep in mind that this isn't just restricted to African Americans or issues of black versus white. In the case of Dallas, for example, they've been long struggling with how best to remember Cesar Chavez, foreign labor leader, Latino Hispanic leader, and they've been going back and forth about whether to rename Industrial Boulevard. Folks have suggested, well, if we rename it after Chavez, like the word industrial has a lot of cachet. But if we name it after Chavez, would that hurt development? That's actually been one of the arguments. By the way, that's one of the arguments we hear about naming streets for King, which I'll address later in a few minutes. This has even become important in the case of President Obama, where there have actually been schools and places, and Antigua is named a mountain for President Obama. This is actually, you hang around the internet, and by the way, all good things happen on the internet. If you hang around the internet long enough and read people's comments, this has really brought some people's opinions out. Very much, by the way, that some of the similar discussions we have heard about the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Is this premature? Are we getting ahead of ourselves, sort of making this person an important part of our history when there's still a lot of work to be done? And to be honest with you, I see it a little different. And I'm not saying, I still have mixed feelings about whether this is the right thing to do at the right time, but it really, for me, makes a lot of sense when you consider the fact that for so long, our streets really reflected a very white-centric notion of the past. And now that we have the opportunity to actually recognize that we have our first African-American president. I think people are really rushing to make that happen, make that clear on the landscape. And I think that speaks less to do with Obama and speaks more to the cultural need that some people feel to have this remembered, however ultimately it may turn out. Let's talk a little bit about the power of street naming, because I get a lot of questions from folks, the media. Why street name? Why name a street? Why not build a monument? And I showed you how successful monuments are. Why not create a scholarship program? Why not do this? And I will say this, that even though street naming is important along with all those other things, it does have a unique power. And if you think about the way streets work, you think about how you use them as people, how you use them geographically in your daily lives. They really are an amazing way of weaving history into everyday settings. They make the past very tangible, very familiar. And one of the things I would really stress to you is they then can become part of your personal identity. I don't know how many of you do this, but traditionally, the street you lived on, the street you were from, often was very important to one's identity. And I don't know if maybe to a certain extent it still is. But let's do this. This is the only place in Richmond, University of Richmond, where we're going to deconstruct an envelope. All right? If you take a look at the average envelope, there I am. I love to see my name. And right? Okay. I'm just enjoying it. Anyway, the point is, there's my name, and I unfortunately don't live on Martin Luther King. I'll tell you that story later. And there's my hometown, Greenville, North Carolina. And the address itself, one, is a bridge. Is a bridge between my personal identity and my geographic location. And in many ways, it doesn't just make sure that mail gets there. It becomes part of how I fit into the city. It becomes a part of how the very language of the city and how my position is talked about. I still haven't run into Jan and John Doe. Still looking for those folks. You guys are rough. All right. One of the things I would express to you is that, and I'm biased. Admittedly, I'm biased. I'm a geographer. Geographers are hardcore. All right. I don't know how the rest of the disciplines are, but we are hardcore, right? Location is very important to remembering King. I've interviewed enough activists and enough folks, both for and against the initiatives, to tell you that a lot of the debate centers around location. Location, location, location. It centers around where is the best place to remember King. Not whether just to remember, but where best to place King's memory and name on the landscape. And often there's a real intense desire on the part of many African Americans to make sure that King's importance is not confined locationally to the African American neighborhood, as we saw in Chicago. But in fact, that King's name and memory should be visible to a wider public, and more importantly, a white public, in order to communicate his importance. Let me give you an example. Yvonne Akins of Tampa, Florida, years ago they renamed Buffalo for King, which is a major road. I'll show it to you. And she had this to say in defending, and she argued and struggled with this with the city. A street touches more people than if you just named a building after him downtown. People wouldn't go to a building or park named for King Drive, would go to a building or park named for King, would drive on a major thoroughfare for business, personal reasons. They see the name on intersections, on signs pointing to roads, maps. It pops up on addresses, letters, business cards, constantly keeping his name before the public. So in her case, she saw street naming as a way of really inserting King's name and memory into people's daily activities. It was for her very powerful. By the way, you probably hear a fair amount of discussion about how many Martin Luther King streets are run down, how they invariably struggle, how they're always the worst street in town, and I won't lie to you. There have been many cases, where King's name is in fact marginalized. But I will tell you that there's some noted examples of King's name being put on major thoroughfares. Tampa, Florida is an example. Now, I don't like this street. It's congested, it's filled with traffic, it's hard to get around, but it is 14 miles long. It has basically the equivalent of 600 to 800 businesses with its address connected to King. It connects with 2 interstates. It has that visibility that Yvonne Akins was talking about. There's no way of missing that as a symbolic landscape. And that's what many African Americans are after. every street being 14 miles long, but that prominence, that scale. There's that word scale. That's another term geographers love to use, scale. How can scale of memory be manipulated and be controlled and engineered in certain ways? Some people actually think that street naming is very important to the whole process of integration. This was an editorial in the St. Petersburg Times around the same time as the Tampa issue. Renaming a street is a uniquely appropriate way to honor kings. Streets unite diverse neighborhoods. They touch all ages, all races, all economic levels, the resident and the visitor alike. They link people and places that otherwise would remain insular. So this is actually a case where an activist is making a direct connection between the location of that street, its ability to connect people, and King's notion of integration. But remember, and you guys know this, integration can still be controversial. It still is controversial. And so often there's a great deal of opposition to naming major thoroughfares. And often the opposition forces King's name to be confined to parts of roads, segments of larger roads, smaller streets largely within the black community. And I would suggest to you, in a very ironic twist, we're honoring a man who fought against segregation. And in honoring him, we actually in many ways, through this opposition, reinforce the segregation of memory. Give you an example. This is Martin Luther King Circle in Phoenix, Arizona. You know anything about Super Bowl history, you know that Arizona's got a controversial relationship with race relations. But this is actually a cul-de-sac. It has 5 houses on it. It's actually a dead-end street. That in itself speaks volumes. This street came about because of an African-American lady who really wanted King's name on a very prominent road. The council at Phoenix completely resisted, completely shut her down. The only road that was going to be renamed was this cul-de-sac where she lived. She eventually died without ever seeing King's name on a more prominent road. Now this street, because of demographic changes in the Southwest, is not African-American, it's Latino-Hispanic. Marietta, Florida, Martin Luther King Street, Marietta, Florida is 500 feet long. I know because I measured it. That's what geographers do. Right? We measure things. We make sure that they're 500 feet. Some of the people who live on this street, it's highly residential, it's only residential, are perhaps quite, and I know they are because I've spoken to a couple, are quite proud to have the MLK address. So there's nothing wrong with having a small road honored for King. But it really does not fit into what a lot of the original plans of activists were in terms of making a geography of memory that reflects the reputation they believe King deserves. I couldn't resist this. I was driving along. The reason the picture's so bad is in the middle of a thunderstorm. That's the other thing geographers do. We like field work. We like to get out and get wet. I see this is going nowhere. I'll stop talking about that. But here's the point. This is a small road in Woodland, Georgia. The sign was, I did not tear the sign down. Some people have accused me of that. The sign was coming down. I took a picture of it. I gave it a very catchy mantra. The dream turned upside down. If you go down that road, it's a very poor, very depressed road. It has a wastewater treatment facility right next to people's houses. It's right next to a public housing project. It really speaks very volumes about how much King's name has been marginalized. I think it might be the ice. They're making cocktails out there. All right. This is King's namesake in New Orleans, which was impacted by Katrina. And in fact, really in some ways hasn't gotten any better since Katrina. This is one of that street is the home of one of the more notorious housing projects of New Orleans. And if you don't know this, New Orleans has decided to tear down many of those housing projects. And this has opened up big questions about where the poor in New Orleans, particularly the African Americans, should live. And will it just become a gentrified New Orleans? So again, King's name doesn't necessarily bring this poverty or depression. It's often marginalized to these places. Jonathan Tylove, who's a journalist friend of mine, great fellow, wrote a great book. I think it's even better than mine. I hate to say that. Along Martin Luther King, and Jonathan said this, and it's quite poetic. To name any street for King is to invite an accounting of how that street makes good on King's promise, or mocks it. I think if more cities actually sort of embraced that as they evaluated the street naming process, I'm not saying that every street would be perfect or every street naming exercise would be perfect, but I think it'd be a little bit more sensitive to what politicians are doing and how geography matches up with memory. Let's talk a little bit about the politics of street naming. This is actually from my hometown. One of the things I want to show you or emphasize to you is that often the street naming process is about scale and boundaries. How's it about scale? There's often a big debate about at what scale should we remember him. Should he be scaled at the African American level only, or should he be or have his memory scaled in such a way that he is of relevance to African Americans in the whole city and whites? And it's often about boundaries, because within southern cities and within cities outside the South, you have very traditional racial economic boundaries that the street naming process runs into. And how do you negotiate those boundaries when you try to remember a figure that was very integrated in his cause? In the case of Greenville, you see their solution. 1998, African American activists wanted all of 5th Street named for King. The city council only allowed them to name the western part of 5th Street, which was predominantly African American and a little bit lower scale development. They refused to rename the eastern part of 5th Street, which was largely white and more upscale development. These activists, who I've had the pleasure of working with personally, every year after that went back to the city council asking for all of 5th Street, asking for all of 5th Street. And in fact, one of them had this great quote, "A whole man deserves a whole street." Sort of nice. Well, the city council never budged. 2007, the city council says this has been a contentious issue for too long. We're going to move King's name off of the street. And they did, and they moved it to the bypass around town. So the folks who used to live on Martin Luther King lost their address, so that they basically wouldn't force whites on East 5th Street to change theirs. And now King's namesake is on a bypass that's impossible to do a march. It's impossible to do anything organized or mobilized. King's memory is just a sign. It's not an address. It's not that narrative that I've been talking about. There's an interesting story about Austin, Texas. I wonder if you know about this, David. Austin faced the same issue. It renamed a street for King, and that street does cut across some major boundaries within the city. Also connects some major parts of the city. But when it first was done, there was so much opposition to it that the city considered rescinding its decision. So J.J. Seabrook, who was a prominent African American in the city, actually a former president of a local college, went before the city council to argue, to plead, don't remove King's name. Let King's name be on the whole street. He, in the middle of the city council debate, he grabs his chest, he collapses, he dies on the spot. Now, as much as I hate the fact that Dr. Seabrook had to pass away, it was probably the best thing for this street. Because there's no way those politicians were going to basically make that decision, rescind that order in the face of a very prominent activist literally dying for the cause. You see what I'm getting at? This is how emotional, believe it or not, this is just street naming. This is how emotional and loaded this can be. One of the first places I ever learned about a street being named for King, it actually sparked some of my interest in the subject, was Chattanooga. African American leaders of Chattanooga wanted to rename all of 9th Street for King. The city council, like in the case of Texas, like in the case of Greenville, said no, we're only going to name part of it. African American leaders didn't like that. They organized a boycott. They organized a march, which you see there in the middle of the summer. They put ladders up on street signs. They climbed up those ladders. They plastered King's name on the existing street sign. They ceremonially and temporarily renamed that street for King. The gravity of that demonstration, along with the support of some white clergy in town, that's an important issue we'll get to in a minute, won the day, and all of 9th Street in Chattanooga is named for King. You see what I'm getting at? There's a history and a geography of struggle here that is often behind many of these streets. We just don't know it. Where every street in America is named for King, there's a story. Maybe not nearly as dramatic as this, but there's a story to be told. In Chapel Hill, they had an existing street named for King, but it was a very small street that ran through just next to a few houses. Leaders of the NAACP there locally decided they wanted a more prominent road, so they pushed to have Airport Road named for King, major thoroughfare. You know about this? That's where you're from.
Yeah.
Well, it was a very divisive issue. A man here can probably come down and give us a graphic about it. But the point is, it's a very divisive issue. They ultimately passed it, but I'll be honest with you, it probably would not have passed if not for some significant white support from some of the people in City Council. Whether you agree or not, the point is that much of the street naming that happens that really reflects this integrative style has to involve ultimately whites and blacks working together to actually make it happen. And in that regard, they're extremely valuable symbols of King's philosophy. There's also a political economy to the street naming issue that's worth mentioning. Some of the most vocal opponents to street naming are business and property owners. They often cite things like the cost of an address change. That was actually one of the arguments we heard a lot with Airport Road. Some people fear that property values will decline as a result of King's name. There's a bit of stigmatization that happens. I don't know if you've ever run into folks that, this Chris Rock comedy routine, he talks about when someone ever calls you and they're at a Martin Luther King Street and asks you what to do, tell them to run. Believe it or not, even though I think Chris Rock is an extremely valuable commentator, he's extremely good at pointing the inequalities that we have in the world, that probably comedy skit has done more damage to the street naming campaign. I actually have sat in on city council meetings where citizens will cite that comedy routine as proof, not as a joke, not as something to reflect on, but as actual proof that you rename a street for King, you're going to bring down the quality of life. In Greenville, and people on the eastern part of 5th Street wanted to resist naming the street for King. Some folks, I interviewed them, they said on the record in the newspaper, they were scared that if they named that street for King, that people would start setting up drug tables. They start selling drugs at every corner. I mean, this is how much of an overreaction. And in many ways, it's a very rationalized form of discrimination. Not rationalized in the sense that it's legitimate, but rationalized in the sense that it's not about hating someone because of their skin color. It's about deeper anxieties about race and power and losing one's place in society. And it's all often done under the rationalization of property and development. Very insidious in this regard. By the way, one of the big movements we see now is that when cities don't want to deal with the street naming issue, they create ordinances that say that you have to get a certain percentage of property owners to sign off on any street name change. For example, in some cities, you have to have 100% of all property owners on a street to agree to a street name change. The likelihood of me getting 100% of property owners is very unlikely, and you can imagine how hard it would be for an African American who's proposing something controversial. Some cities say 75%. I take issue with the ordinances, by the way. It's a very elitist conception of urban governance. Because who's to say that just because you own property, you should be the sole decision maker? In addition to the fact that it does not in any way take into consideration that that street is of more meaning than just people who own property on that street. It is a vested interest to a lot of stakeholders in the city. Some people often ask me at community forums, is having a Martin Luther King address bad for business? I've spoken with enough people, interviewed people in real estate, and I see no evidence and found no evidence that a street name change actually leads to a decline in property values. I have a colleague down in Florida who's doing a study right now, doing a pre and a post study to actually see from hedonic analysis, to actually look at how property has changed in neighborhoods that are renamed, to see if in fact there is anything. But early indications are none. King's name doesn't cause poverty. His name is sometimes placed in already depressed areas. And I often make the argument to city council people that instead of just emphasizing the issue of how much does it cost to change an address, let's think about how much is the social cost of not renaming. I mean, we talk about wanting to create discussions about equality and solve big problems. And people often will tell you, well, this isn't a big problem. Well, if we're going to solve the big problems, we've got to at least come across like we're willing to be sensitive to some of the smaller issues. And this is a good example. The social cost of not renaming could actually be quite much more than the dollar amount of changing the name of the street. We've even looked at, gathered a lot of data, statistics again, looking at all the businesses in the U.S. with a Martin Luther King address, and compared that to all businesses with a Market Street address, and compare that to all the businesses in America with a Main Street address. And what you see is if you look at their annual sales volume, which is an indicator of how well they do, right? How much money they make. And what you see is, in fact, Martin Luther King, businesses on Martin Luther King Street are quite on par with other major streets in America. And in fact, compared to Main Street, and Main Street's taking a hit, we all know that. Compared to Main Street, Martin Luther King Street actually has a higher percentage of businesses that actually make at least $2.5 million or more. So a lot of the stereotypical notions that we have about King's name being only about economically depressed, the worst place in town, it just doesn't show up all the time. And that's not to dismiss that there are places with King's name that struggle, and that those places need assistance. They need a way of bringing King's name to a higher level. But we can't keep talking about this through only stereotypes. I can take you to Newbern, North Carolina, which isn't too far from where I live. See this guy? Are you a North Carolina guy?
Yeah.
Power to you, baby. All right. We'll have drinks later. All right. Newbern, North Carolina. I can take you to Newbern, where there's a pretty prominent thoroughfare named for King. Has over 200 non-residential institutions. Has several national chains. A Walmart. Car dealerships. Softball bottling. You want to tell the group here what makes Newbern famous in terms of soft drink?
I actually don't know.
It's all right. You guys ever drink Pepsi? Newbern was the place where Pepsi was invented. And in fact, you go to Martin Luther King in Newbern, there's a Pepsi Cola bottling plant. So again, this isn't a big city. This is, a nice city. It's not a big city like Richmond, but it itself strikes and challenges that stereotype. And I actually would suggest to you that even if you don't find places with Pepsi bottling plants, there's probably a lot of streets that challenge those perceptions in some form or fashion. That's the great thing about being a geographer. Recognizing diversity, recognizing that places are very different from each other at the same time that they can be similar. I keep plugging that geography, buddy. The difference is, the reason that this major thoroughfare got renamed has a lot to do with the fact that the name change was phased in over time. So it took care of that address change issue. And the fact that it had the great vocal support of a white mayor. Again, this idea that what kind of race relations, contemporary race relations, are reflected in these streets. For some of those streets, it reflects a continued segregation. For some of these streets, there's actually cooperation. I guess what I'm trying to get at is I want to give you guys a critical analysis of these streets and hopefully make you think critically, but also have a little bit more optimism. Concluding remarks. Everybody loves a conclusion, including me. Street naming may appear at first glance to be insignificant, but it's related to larger issues of race, power, and fairness in America. I believed that when I first started studying it. I still believe it now. Geography of the streets, its location, its scale, where it takes place, their position in relation to traditional racial and economic boundaries is very important to the whole process of street naming. It's important to the meaning of King's commemoration. Martin Luther King streets are really, in some ways, an interesting way of ground-truthing claims of racial equality. We all can talk about racial equality existing in a very abstract level. And we can all say, and I think many of you probably would, you seem like a good group of folks, well, we all really embrace racial equality. But it's still, until you take that ideology and you put it to the ground, until you nail it to asphalt, will you ever really truly see how people behave about race and equality and power? And in that regard, these street names and these street signs and the roads are actually a pretty valuable indicator of how far we got to go. And that leads us to my last conclusion, that these aren't just memorials of the past. It's easy to just think of them as the past, but they're really indicative of the unfinished nature of the movement. Many scholars have talked about the long civil rights movement, that in fact we unfortunately cut off looking at the movement by using these major watershed marks. King is one of those watershed marks. But in fact, we really need to look at the movement as a larger, longer evolutionary struggle that goes on right now as we speak. This is why being in the South right now is a very exciting time. Appreciate your time.